It was Friday, the end of the work week. Paul leaned back in his chair, made his usual notes in his journal, writing down what he had accomplished and what he needed to do next, and then began gathering his briefcase. He had started writing down his daily activities many years ago. Sometimes there were days when, at the end of the workday, he couldn't remember a single productive achievement, despite all his efforts, and the very fact of writing this down in his journal was a great motivator. Besides, on good days, it was nice to take a moment to talk about his efforts and the progress he had made. In any case, he wrote down what he needed to do next so he wouldn't lose the ideas he had come up with during the day. This simple exercise always helped him get started the next day. Jerry poked his head in the door and said, "Paul, we're getting ready to have a drink and a bite to eat. Why don't you join us?" Paul started to decline, but then thought, "What the heck? There's nothing waiting for me at home but indifference." The last month had been tough, and if Paul had been honest with himself, he would have admitted that the last 6 months hadn't been the best either. His wife, Barbara, was becoming increasingly indifferent. What started as excessive distraction grew into small acts of neglect, until in the last few weeks her comments had become downright dismissive. When Paul first brought it up, she apologized, but lately she seemed increasingly annoyed by his complaints and began talking to him as if he were a child. It seemed that respect was lacking in his home, and to say that Paul was unhappy at home would be an understatement. Nevertheless, Paul thought that perhaps it was just a passing phase and called his wife to let her know he would be late. Her response did not warm his heart. "I don't care. I'm working late anyway. Go out for dinner, or there are frozen meals in the freezer." With that, she hung up without waiting for a response. "Bitch," he muttered under his breath. The get-together with his co-workers turned into dinner with friends, until one by one they had to say goodnight and go home. Paul was left alone and thought it was time for him to leave too, even though he didn't feel like it. Being a man who always thought about his work, he took a few folded sheets of paper out of his jacket pocket and began to take notes, slowly finishing only his second beer of the evening. He was programming a microprocessor, and the code had to be compact and efficient. Paul knew his stuff and liked to describe it as pouring a liter of beer into a pint glass without spilling a drop. Paul was engrossed in the details of the code when a quiet voice behind him said, "Paul, mind if I join you?" He looked up, knowing whose voice it was. It was Jenny. Paul couldn't help but smile. They had been working together for over a year, and Jenny was a smart woman with a kind heart. He found her to be kind to everyone and, to be honest, a little vulnerable. He liked that. When she entered, a gentle warmth filled the room, and she was exactly what he needed at that moment. "I thought you left." "Well, I went to the ladies' room, and then I saw you sitting here alone." Pointing to the chair across from him at the table, he said, "Please, I wouldn't mind some company." Jenny didn't sit in the chair he offered her, but instead sat down on the chair next to Paul. Looking into his eyes and then leaning in to deliberately reduce the distance between them so she could see his notes, she asked, "What are you working on?" Paul smiled sheepishly. "I'm just working on a piece of code for this processor. We're trying to do too much at once." Jenny smiled. She knew about Paul's talents. "If anyone can do it, it's you." Paul grinned briefly. He wasn't used to receiving many compliments these days. "Well, we can't pretend it's too easy, can we? Management needs to know that we can do the most difficult work and that the impossible just takes a little longer." That's how they spent the next hour. They talked about work and exchanged a few unflattering remarks about the company's management, which they nevertheless respected for the most part, and then, without much fanfare, she turned the conversation to their personal lives. She told him about her parents' wedding and her older brother, and tried to get him to talk. You see, Jenny knew more than she let on. It was already past 8 when the discussion was winding down. Paul finished the glass of tonic with lime he had switched to, not wanting any more beer, and Jenny realized it was now or never. She was inexperienced in this and had mixed feelings because Paul was a married man. but she was determined to give it a try. "Why don't we go to the ballroom and dance a little?" Paul gave her a strange, embarrassed look. Then Jenny added, "Then maybe you could give me a ride home." She was a shy young woman, and this was the most shameless thing she had ever done. At that moment, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice with no solid ground beneath her. Paul hesitated. I really need to get home. Barbara's probably making dinner for me." It was a lie. Barbara wasn't interested in him or his dinner. But he was a married man and felt he was in a dangerous place. Jenny bowed her head and muttered, "I just thought that maybe after what Barbara told me, you might want to spend some time with me." That statement alone hit Paul like a heavyweight punch. "What do you mean? After what Barbara told you?" Jenny looked at him with sadness and confusion in her eyes. "I just saw her last Tuesday when I was out with my friends, and she explained to me what you two had agreed." Agreed? Agreed to what? Now Jenny was not only embarrassed, but also confused. "I saw her with a man I didn't know, and it surprised me because she wasn't behaving quite like a wife should. She saw me looking at her, so she came over and explained that you knew and that you had one of those open marriages." Paul was stunned. What did she do that wasn't appropriate for a wife? Jenny felt increasingly uncomfortable. First, she had done something she had never done before by asking a married man to meet her, and now she was telling Paul things about his marriage that he seemed to know nothing about. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything." Jenny got up to leave, but Paul stopped her and asked her to stay. He tried to collect his thoughts and finally said, "Jenny, if I'm in an open marriage, no one ever told me that. Barbara and I talked about fidelity long before we got married, and cheating in any form was strictly forbidden. However, to be honest, the last 6 months or so have not been pleasant at home. I've been trying to piece everything together and figure out what went wrong, and I think you might be able to help me fill in the missing pieces of the puzzle. Is my wife cheating on me?" It was a terrible burden for Jenny to carry on her shoulders. Paul deserved the truth, but Jenny's knowledge was uncertain at best, so she didn't want to destroy his marriage with false statements. Nevertheless, the dancing, combined with the caresses and teenage kisses, left no room for doubt. "I don't know, but if I had a husband and he behaved the way I've seen her behave, he wouldn't be my husband for long." Paul was at a loss, not knowing which way to go. This new information allowed him to make sense of the events of the past few months. Barbara was having an affair, and it was taking up all her time while she was awake. No wonder she didn't have time for her husband anymore. Her thoughts were occupied by another man. Paul slammed his fists on the table. "Bitch!" This time it wasn't so quiet. Paul shouted, and everyone at every table in the room heard him. Jenny flinched, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh no, not you, not you." Paul knew what he had to do. Standing facing the room and seeing that everyone was looking at him, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I'm sorry, my girlfriend just gave me some bad news." Then turning to Jenny, who looked stunned, he continued, "She's a wonderful woman and a good friend. I didn't mean her. I would never mean her. You know that, Jenny, don't you? I would never call you that." Jenny nodded, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She mourned her friend and felt the pain he was going through. Paul sat down and took Jenny's hands. "You know I would never call you that, don't you? You are a lovely, wonderful woman whom I am honored to call my friend." Now Jenny smiled and leaned in to hug the man. Wiping away her tears, she asked him, "What are you going to do?" Paul had never considered anything like this before. "I don't know. I could ask her, but would she tell me the truth?" Jenny slowly shook her head. "Anyone who cheats will lie," she thought. "Maybe I should hire a private investigator. How much would that cost?" He thought about it. My God, did she bring him to our house? Paul couldn't tell if he was thinking rationally or letting his imagination run wild, so he tried his best to steady his breathing and wondered if there could be another explanation. They sat together for a while, talking and thinking, but they didn't come to any real conclusions. Finally, it was time to leave, and they went out together. "Paul, I'm sorry for what I said earlier." Paul was confused. "What do you mean?" He honestly couldn't remember anything Jenny had said that could have hurt him. Her voice sounded extremely embarrassed. "I asked you to come to my house. I've never done that with a married man before. It's just—" She couldn't finish her sentence. Paul hugged Jenny and whispered in her ear, "That was the nicest compliment I've ever received, and the most tempting." He took a step back to look at her. "If Barbara is cheating on me, I'll file for divorce. I won't live with a cheater." He smiled sadly. "If I end up alone, you better be ready, because I'm coming after you. You are without a doubt the sweetest woman I've ever known. You're smart, funny, and you have a big heart. I wish I'd met you sooner." It was a powerful confession, but deep down, he knew that the story Jenny had told him was true. Still feeling like a married man, he kissed her on the forehead, took one last sad look at the woman who cared more about him than his own wife, and headed for his car. Paul sat in his car for a few more minutes, thinking about what he had learned. Everything fell into place. The constant distraction, her attitude toward him, and now this new discovery, it all fit together like an indecent puzzle. Would he confront her, spy on her, or just ask her directly? He wanted certainty. At that moment, doubt was as much his enemy as his wife's behavior. He drove home, not paying much attention to the road, trying to decide what to do about Barbara. Was he sure she was cheating on him? A husband doesn't want to believe what his own thoughts are telling him. How could he find out? How was he supposed to deal with this? When he pulled up to his house, he still didn't have an answer. He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't notice the car parked on the street in front of his house. Entering his house through the back door, he decided that he would try to avoid his wife tonight. He just wanted to be alone. If her behavior was the same as it had been in recent weeks, that wouldn't be difficult. He needed time to think. She didn't give him any. "Paul, please come into the living room." Taking a deep breath, he walked through the archway into the living room. There, sitting on the sofa, was his wife with a man he didn't recognize. The man was holding her hand and grinning. "Paul, we need to talk." In an instant, everything became clear, and he knew the answers to all his questions. He saw her guilt, he knew her intentions, and he knew what he was going to do. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and he felt his back straighten and his shoulders relax. "Hi, wifey. I hear we're in an open marriage. Imagine my surprise." Epilogue. It's not hard to guess what happened next. Paul took the divorce in a way he could never have imagined. Now he saw Barbara in a whole new light, and it wasn't very pleasant. For her part, she was hurt by how quickly and easily Paul had written her out of his life. She had lived for a long time under the illusion that she loved two men, and the collapse of that dream affected her entire life. It was a simple divorce. At the time, they had no children. There was nothing to divide in the small house where they had just started living together. She took what she wanted from the little they had, they divided their money, and that was that. Paul will never forget that terrible night when his world fell apart and he found freedom. 6 months later, shortly after the divorce was finalized, Paul approached Jenny and asked, "Jenny, would you like to go out to dinner and maybe dance a little this weekend?" He would see that same 1,000-watt smile for many years to come, and he would never tire of it. Don't judge Jenny too harshly. Trying to seduce married men had never been her style. She saw a man she admired and decided he deserved better. As soon as Paul was free, they hit it off.